The night shadow saved us all. A dog you'll never forget. It was a night when the world felt silent, but danger prowled just beyond the snow-laden trees. Emily clutched the harness of a German shepherd, her small hands trembling, yet somehow steady. Shadow's ears twitched, his body taut, eyes scanning every shadow, every sound. The wind carried more than cold. It carried whispers of those who meant harm. Ben's breath was sharp, visible in the frigid air, and Mark limped a little behind, each step heavy with fatigue and fear. But none of them were alone. Not really. Shadow, battle-scarred yet unbroken, had been through storms far worse than this. And tonight, he would prove again that loyalty isn't just instinct. It's courage, timing, and heart. As footprints circled in the snow, Emily didn't cry. Instead, she whispered to Shadow, as if he could hear her thoughts. "Lead us home." And he did. Every step, every growl, every protective glance told a story older than words, a story of survival, trust, and love that could not be broken. What happened next would test every ounce of bravery they had, and reveal just how far a dog's loyalty could go. The storm came first, a wall of white swallowing the mountains of Colorado, as if the sky itself had decided to erase everything beneath it. Wind roared through the pines, bending the tall trees until their frozen branches snapped like brittle bones. Snow scoured the ground in waves, curling off ridgelines, reducing the world to a blur of white and grey. It was not merely weather, it was a siege. Every sound was muted by the storm, except the hollow scream of the wind tearing down the slopes. Somewhere in that blizzard, a battered pickup sat skewed off a logging road, its headlights buried under drifts of snow. Flames licked the edges of its bed, smoke curling into the storm, struggling against the gale. Inside the cab, 3 men stirred, bound hand and foot, their breath fogging against the glass before the heat began to rise. Captain Mark Ellison blinked against the smoke and the sting in his eyes. His head pounded, vision swimming, until he realized the acrid scent of gasoline wasn't a dream. The seatbelt across his chest had been cut. Instead, ropes bit deep into his wrists. He tried to move, but the bonds held tight, cruelly knotted. Every inhale tasted of soot. Somewhere close, metal popped with the sound of expanding heat. "Captain? Captain?" The voice was weak, hoarse. Mark turned his head. To his right, Sergeant Rafael Torres gritted his teeth, the flames reflected in his dark eyes. He was coughing hard, shoulders straining against the ropes that pinned him to the seat. Behind them, in the cramped space of the cab, rookie Kyle Jensen stirred, groaning like a child half awake from a nightmare. The nightmare was real. Mark's throat burned as he forced the words out. "Sound off. Is everyone alive?" Kyle coughed, his voice cracking. I think so. My chest hurts." "Stay with us," Raphael barked, his tone edged with urgency, though he was barely holding it together himself. The fire outside spat sparks through the shattered rear window. Already the heat was unbearable. The cab had become an oven. Snowstorm or not, the truck was seconds from becoming their coffin. Mark forced his mind through the haze. The ambush had been sudden. Too sudden. They were supposed to be escorting evidence back down the mountain road. One moment, headlights pierced the whiteout. The next came the thunder of gunfire, tires exploding, the truck rolling. But what haunted Mark most was not the attack. It was the way the shooters had known their route. It had come from inside. That realization cut deeper than the rope around his wrists. Betrayal had a smell, a weight, and now it filled the cab like the smoke choking them. "Listen," Mark rasped, forcing calm into his voice, though fear clawed at his ribs. "This isn't random. Somebody sold us out." Raphael swore under his breath, coughing hard. "I knew it. I damn well knew something was off back at the station. The way Kane looked at me." He stopped, teeth clenched against pain. Kyle thrashed weakly. "Why tie us up? Why not just shoot us?" Mark closed his eyes for half a second, fighting dizziness. "Because fire erases evidence. Makes us look like an accident in the storm." The rookie went silent. That silence was worse than any scream. Flames spread across the truck bed, crawling hungrily toward the gas tank. Mark's instincts screamed. They had minutes, maybe less. He twisted his wrists, but the rope burned deeper. His body screamed in protest, the wound in his shoulder from the crash bleeding sluggishly. Every motion stole precious oxygen. The storm outside howled, snow hissing as it touched the flames. The world was reduced to 3 men trapped in a steel cage, listening to the crackle of fire and the drum of their own racing hearts. Raphael slammed his boots against the door. "Damn it. Won't budge. They jammed it." The smoke thickened, swirling black inside the cab. Kyle began to panic, gasping in short, shallow breaths, his eyes wide and wild. "We're gonna die in here." "Quiet," Mark snapped, his voice raw but commanding. "Panic burns faster than fire. Breathe slow. Save your air." But even as he spoke, he wondered if he believed his own words. Through the side window, snow swirled like ash in a furnace. For one mad second, Mark thought he saw movement, a shadow against the white. He blinked, sure it was just smoke dancing in his vision. Then came a sound, faint but real, the bark of a dog, carried thin through the storm. Mark's heart stumbled in his chest. He turned his head, straining to see. Nothing but snow and fire. But the bark came again, closer this time, sharp, insistent. "Did you hear that?" Kyle whispered, desperate hope cracking his voice. Raphael narrowed his eyes, sweat and smoke streaking his face. "A dog? Out here?" The ropes bit deeper as Mark tried again, harder, to free himself. Fire roared louder, and somewhere beneath them, the gas tank groaned. He knew the sound. He'd heard it in war zones, in wrecked Humvees. It was the sound of seconds running out. "Whoever's out there," Mark's voice broke. He forced it steady. "That's our only chance." Outside, beyond the storm, the shadow moved again. Small, fragile. Not a soldier, not a rescuer. A child's silhouette against the blizzard, her hand clutching the harness of a scarred German shepherd, but that was impossible. Smoke curled like claws around the men as they stared through the cracked glass, disbelief burning in their lungs more than the fire ever could. The storm howled. The truck hissed. And into that inferno stepped a girl no older than 7, eyes narrowed against the snow, her small frame dwarfed by the shepherd at her side. For the first time since the ambush, Mark Ellison felt something stronger than fear. He felt the raw shock of a miracle. The fire was winning. Flames crawled across the truck bed like predators unleashed, gnawing through metal and paint, sending showers of sparks into the storm. Each gust of wind only seemed to feed the inferno, hurling embers back against the shattered cab. The smoke thickened until it pressed against their faces like a living thing, choking their lungs, blinding their eyes. Mark Ellison coughed so hard he felt blood rise in his throat. His body screamed for air, for release, for something other than the crushing heat that seared his skin even through his uniform. He could hear Raphael struggling beside him, each cough sounding like it might be his last. Kyle was half-conscious now, lips blue from lack of oxygen, his wrists raw from thrashing against the ropes. The captain's mind, trained to hold order in chaos, was failing. His vision blurred. A soldier learns to fight fire with calm, but there was no calm here. Only the growing certainty that they were seconds from becoming nothing more than 3 bodies in a burned-out husk. And then, a shape moved in the storm. At first, Mark thought it was another hallucination, smoke and flame twisting his senses. But it grew clearer. A small silhouette pushing through the snow, fragile against the storm. The figure stumbled once, then righted itself, holding tight to something dark that moved with her. Mark's heart lurched. A child. Out here. The girl could not have been more than 7. Her coat was too thin for the weather, the hood sliding back as the wind clawed at her hair. But she didn't falter. In her tiny hand she clutched a harness, and beside her, guiding her step for step, came a German shepherd with scars across his flank and muzzle. Shadow. The dog bounded forward, eyes catching the firelight, ears pinned back against the heat. His growl cut through the roar of the flames, a sound that spoke of fury and protection. The girl, Emily, though they did not yet know her name, shielded her face with one arm, the other gripping the harness as if it were the only anchor in the storm. The officers stared, disbelief raw in their eyes. Of all the impossible things, the betrayal, the ambush, the fire, this was the one their minds could not process. Salvation, arriving not in the form of fellow soldiers or rescue teams, but a child and a scarred shepherd. Shadow leapt onto the truck bed without hesitation. The heat scorched his paws, but he didn't stop. With a snarl, he lunged at the ropes binding Mark's wrists, teeth sawing at the fibers. His jaws worked with savage precision, each bite tearing them closer to freedom. "Dear God," Raphael whispered hoarsely. "That dog." Emily reached the side of the burning truck, her small hands braced against the steel that radiated unbearable heat. She squinted through smoke and sparks, coughing but refusing to back away. Her cheeks were red, her hair matted with snow, but there was no fear in her eyes, only determination. Mark locked eyes with her for a heartbeat through the shattered glass. He saw innocence, yes, but also something older, something carved by pain. The way she stood there, unwavering against fire and storm, was not natural for a child. "Hold still," she cried, her voice tiny, yet cutting through the roar. Shadow yanked harder. The rope snapped at last, slicing Mark's skin as it gave way. Blood flowed, but freedom surged through him like oxygen. He gasped, dragging in a lungful of smoke-tainted air, but it was enough. "Get the others," he rasped. Shadow spun, his teeth finding Raphael's bonds. The sergeant gritted his teeth, forcing his shoulders forward, giving the dog room to tear at the ropes. The fibers frayed, burned, then split. Raphael ripped his arms free, coughing violently, before leaning forward to shield Kyle. Emily climbed into the cab, ignoring the searing heat. She tugged at Kyle's arm, small fingers pressing desperately against the rope at his wrists. Her strength was slight, but the gesture itself snapped something inside him. Somewhere beneath the panic, the rookie found enough will to keep breathing, to not surrender yet. "Come on," Emily urged. Her voice was shaking, but not from fear, from urgency. "Please." With a final wrench, Shadow shredded the last of Kyle's bindings. The young officer slumped forward, nearly collapsing, but Emily pulled at him with surprising force. It was as if the storm itself had lent her strength. Mark pushed against the door. It gave way just as the fire reached the gas tank. The sound that followed was not just an explosion. It was the mountain itself cracking open. Flames billowed skyward, a bloom of orange and black against the whiteout. Shards of metal tore free, whistling through the storm. Snow hissed and turned to steam. The officers tumbled into the drifts, dragging Emily and Kyle with them, as Shadow barked ferociously, guiding them away from the debris. Heat rolled over their backs, but the snow smothered some of it, sparing them from the worst. For long moments they lay there, lungs heaving, ears ringing, the world nothing but snow and fire. The wreck of the truck burned like a beacon in the storm. Mark rolled onto his side. His eyes found the girl again. Small, trembling, her breath fogging in ragged bursts. Yet she hadn't run. She hadn't let go of Shadow's harness. Raphael stared at her too, disbelief etched in soot across his face. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. "A kid? Out here, and that dog?" Shadow stood firm, chest heaving, blood on his muzzle from the ropes, his stance protective in front of the girl. His eyes scanned the darkness, daring any threat to come closer. Kyle, weak but alive, whispered through cracked lips, "She saved us." The fire consumed the truck behind them, but none of them looked back. All eyes were on the child and her dog, the impossible pair who had pulled them from certain death. In that moment, amidst the ruin and the storm, trust was born, not from rank, not from orders, but from the unlikeliest saviors imaginable. The ropes fell away one by one, curling in the fire like dead snakes. Mark Ellison dragged his wrists free, skin raw and bleeding, where Shadow's teeth had cut the cords. Rafael Torres ripped loose his own bindings, every breath sounding like gravel in his throat. Kyle Jensen slumped against the seat, his young face pale with smoke and terror, his arms trembling as if they no longer belonged to him. And then, in the split second between survival and annihilation, the world shifted. The truck's gas tank gave a groan, deep and metallic, like the final breath of something monstrous. Mark's instincts screamed before his mind caught up. "It's going to blow." "Move!" he roared, his voice shredded by smoke. They threw themselves toward the door. Snow and fire collided as the pickup's carcass erupted behind them. The explosion came in slow motion, stretching seconds into an eternity. A blossom of fire tore skyward, a sphere of orange and black that ripped the storm apart. Shards of steel spun like knives through the whiteout, glowing red as they sliced into the snow. Heat rolled over their backs, slamming them down into the drifts. Sound became a deafening roar, muffled by the storm, until it felt both distant and crushingly near. Mark's ears rang with a high, piercing whine. His vision flickered white with shock. For a moment he thought he'd gone deaf, until another sound cut through, the sharp, furious barking of the shepherd. Shadow. The dog had planted himself between the wreck and the humans, body braced, barking with primal urgency. His stance was not just instinct, it was command, a demand to keep moving, to live. Emily, coughing, half buried in snow, reached for Kyle. Her small hand clamped around his sleeve with startling strength. The rookie could barely rise, but she pulled at him with the will of someone far older. Her voice was tiny, broken by smoke, but it cut into him like steel. "Get up. Come on." Kyle blinked through tears, choking on air that felt like glass. For an instant, he saw not a child, but an anchor, holding him to life. With a groan, he stumbled forward, guided by her grip. Raphael staggered up, snow caking his beard, flames reflecting in his eyes. He turned just in time to see the second wave of the explosion, metal ripping free from the truck, hurling outward. He lunged, throwing himself over Emily and Kyle, shielding them as debris hissed into the drifts around them. Mark fell last, half crawling, half dragging his wounded leg. Each pull of muscle sent fire up his thigh, but the memory of heat on his back drove him harder. He collapsed into the snow only yards away from the others, chest heaving. For long moments, none of them spoke. Only the storm filled the silence. The hiss of snow against fire, the howl of wind carrying the smoke upward like a funeral pyre. Slowly, Mark lifted his head. His eyes met the girl's. She was shaking, her cheeks streaked with soot and tears, but she hadn't let go of Kyle's sleeve. Her other hand still gripped Shadow's harness, knuckles white. The captain's throat tightened. He had seen soldiers break under less. Yet this child stood. Raphael rolled onto his back, sucking in air, then barked a harsh laugh that turned into a cough. A kid. A damn kid and her dog. Tell me I'm not seeing things. You're not, Mark rasped, wiping blood from his temple. His gaze returned to the shepherd. That dog just saved our lives. Shadow stood tall in the snow, chest rising and falling, his breath steaming. One paw bled where the trap had cut him earlier, but he bore the weight without a sound. His eyes never left the burning wreck, as if daring the flames themselves to come closer. Kyle finally found his voice, thin and broken. Why would you help us? His question was half to the girl, half to the dog, half to the storm itself. Emily's lips trembled, but she answered with quiet certainty. Because you were trapped. And Shadow, he always knows. The words were simple, but they landed with the force of revelation. Mark felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt since before betrayal became their daily companion, since before his daughter's death hollowed out the better part of him. Gratitude. Not the fleeting kind, but the raw, bone-deep gratitude of men pulled back from the edge by impossible hands. The snow swirled thicker, covering their tracks, burying the debris of the truck, as if the mountain wanted the evidence hidden. But no storm could bury what had just been forged. 3 soldiers, broken and betrayed, had been pulled from fire by the most unlikely pair imaginable. A child and her scarred shepherd. And in that impossible salvation, the first thread of trust was spun. Not trust in the system that had abandoned them. Not trust in the chain of command that had led them into an ambush. But trust in this girl who hadn't run. And the dog who had stood his ground. Mark pushed himself upright, his leg screaming in protest. He reached out, his hand brushing Emily's shoulder, steadying her in the storm. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. Emily blinked up at him, snow clinging to her lashes. She didn't smile. She only nodded once, as if saving 3 grown men from a fireball was nothing more than what had to be done. Shadow barked once, sharp and decisive, before turning his head toward the dark trees beyond the road. His body stiffened, hackles rising. The message was clear. The fire was behind them, but danger was not gone. Mark followed the dog's gaze, the soldier in him snapping back to life. Whatever came next, they were no longer 3 men alone. They were 5 souls bound by survival, and the mountain storm carried them forward, away from fire and into whatever waited in the shadows. The storm did not ease after the explosion. If anything, it seemed angrier, as though the mountain itself wanted to finish what the fire had not. Snow fell in sheets, each gust slamming into them like fists of ice. Their breath fogged instantly, clinging to their lashes, freezing into crystals that stung their skin. Every step was a battle, every moment a fight not to collapse into the white abyss that stretched endlessly around them. Mark Ellison led the group, though lead was too generous. His limp was worsening, blood soaking through the torn fabric at his thigh. The shrapnel wound was deeper than he had admitted in the chaos. Each movement sent agony surging up his leg, threatening to buckle him. He leaned hard into the storm, his jaw clenched, determined not to show weakness in front of his men, or the child who had already carried more weight than any child should. Kyle Jensen stumbled behind him, coughing violently, his chest rattling with every breath. Smoke inhalation from the truck clung to his lungs like poison. His face was pale, lips cracked and blue, sweat freezing against his brow. He was young, far too young to already be tasting death. His panic had faded into exhaustion, the kind that could drag a man under without warning. Rafael Torres, grizzled and unyielding, tried to shoulder them both when he could, but even his strength had limits. The storm pushed him back like a wall, testing his willpower with each step. It was Emily who kept them moving. Though she was no taller than Raphael's waist, she walked with uncanny composure, as if she had lived in storms all her life. Her small hand steadied Kyle's sleeve, tugging when he faltered, her voice soft but steady in the roar of the wind. "Breathe slow," she whispered, over and over, guiding him through the rhythm. "In through your nose. Out slow. Like this." Kyle obeyed without protest. There was no defiance in him, only the desperate need to cling to her words. His breathing eased, shallow but steady, as though her calmness had built a bridge across his panic. When Mark stumbled hard into the snow, nearly collapsing, Emily darted forward without hesitation. She pressed a scrap of cloth, an old scarf she carried in her coat pocket, against the bleeding wound on his thigh. Her tiny hands applied pressure with surprising skill, her expression focused, lips trembling but determined. "You have to keep it closed," she said, her voice small but firm, "or you'll lose too much." Mark blinked at her through the haze of pain. She shouldn't have known that, not at her age, but her grip was steady, her eyes clear. She wasn't guessing. She was remembering. "Where? Did you learn that?" he managed through gritted teeth. Emily didn't answer. Her gaze dropped, and she only pressed harder. Shadow paced ahead of them, a dark sentinel in the whiteout. The shepherd's scarred frame moved like a shadow given form, his paws crunching silently despite the snow. Every few steps he froze, ears pricked, head turning sharply toward sounds the humans could not hear. The storm masked everything, but not from him. He sniffed the air, hackles bristling, then continued, circling back to press his shoulder against Emily, as though reminding her he was there. "Dog's on edge," Raphael muttered, glancing nervously into the trees. "Doesn't like what he smells." Mark wiped ice from his lashes. His soldier's instincts agreed. They were being herded by the mountain itself, wounded, blind, vulnerable. If Kane's men were still out there, now would be the time to strike. Emily tightened her grip on the scarf, her face pale but unwavering. She looked up at Mark, then back at the trail ahead, as if daring the storm to challenge her. Shadow barked once, sharp, urgent. The sound made all three soldiers stiffen. "What is it?" Kyle whispered, voice shaking. The shepherd growled low, eyes fixed on the tree line. Nothing visible, only shadows of branches bending under frost. But the message was clear. Danger lurked close. "Keep moving," Mark ordered, voice harsh despite the pain. "Don't stop. Don't give them an easy target." The group trudged forward, Emily half guiding Kyle, half dragging him when his legs wanted to fold. Mark pushed on through sheer willpower, his wound throbbing under the makeshift bandage. Raphael stayed close, his hand hovering near his holster, though his weapon had been lost in the ambush. The snow deepened, swallowing their boots. Shadows flickered between the trees, tricks of the storm, or watchers lying in wait. Every snap of a frozen branch felt like a rifle cocking. At last, after what felt like hours but could not have been more than minutes, the slope broke into a clearing. Through the blur of snow, a dark shape emerged. Crooked walls, a roof sagging under decades of neglect. A cabin, half buried in drifts, its door hanging open like a mouth gasping for air. Relief surged through them, ragged and unsteady. Shelter. Mark nearly collapsed in the snow at the sight, but Emily tugged at his arm, her small voice urgent. "Not yet. Just a little more." Shadow bounded ahead, circling the cabin once, his growl soft but constant. He returned, nuzzling Emily's side as if granting permission. The group stumbled the last stretch, the storm clawing at their backs, before crossing the threshold of the abandoned cabin. The door creaked shut against the wind, and for the first time since the fire, silence fell. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and old timber. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and snow had forced its way in through broken planks. But it was shelter. It was life. Kyle slumped against the wall, coughing until he nearly collapsed. Emily knelt beside him, her hand on his chest, whispering the same steady rhythm she had used before. "Breathe slow. In through your nose. Out. Slow." Mark dropped heavily onto a broken chair, his legs stretched out, blood still seeping through the scarf. He watched her work, watched the way her hands didn't tremble despite her small frame. Gratitude swelled in his chest, heavy and unspoken. Shadow stationed himself at the door, his ears pricked, his body rigid. The storm howled outside, but he was listening for something beyond the wind, something human, something hunting. In the glow of the dying daylight filtering through the cracks, 3 broken soldiers realized they were alive, not because of training or command, but because of a girl and her dog. And in that ruined cabin, under the siege of the storm, the first fragile ember of hope began to burn. The cabin leaned against the storm like an old fighter refusing to fall, half buried in snowdrifts that reached its windows. Its roof sagged, one side caved inward from years of frost and neglect. The door swung on rusted hinges, creaking with every gust, a hollow groan that echoed into the trees like the voice of something long dead. For the battered group, it was more than wood and nails. It was salvation, however temporary. Raphael forced the door open wider with his shoulder, the wood splintering against his weight. The gust of wind that followed carried them inside, slamming the door shut behind them with a thud that rattled the frame. The storm was muffled instantly, replaced by the thick, unmoving silence of a place that had not been disturbed in decades. The air inside was heavy, layered with dust, the scent of old timber, and something faintly metallic, like rust and forgotten tools. The floor creaked under their boots, powdered with frost, where snow had crept in through broken planks. A spiderweb clung to the corner of the ceiling, shimmering faintly as the last grey light filtered through cracks in the wood. Kyle collapsed against the wall, coughing hard into his sleeve. The sound was loud in the silence, echoing against empty walls. Emily knelt by him again, hand on his shoulder, her steady presence somehow more grounding than anything the two veterans could offer. Mark leaned heavily on the remnants of a table, his wounded leg stretched out, teeth clenched as he tore away the makeshift bandage to check the bleeding. His jaw tightened when he saw how deep it had soaked. He said nothing. Words were wasted when pain spoke louder. It was Shadow who moved first. The shepherd padded across the room with deliberate steps, nose low, sniffing each corner with precision. His ears flicked at every sound, the groan of a beam in the wind, the distant creak of the roof under snow. He scratched once at the far wall, then again, more insistently. Emily rose and crossed the room. "What is it?" she asked softly, crouching beside him. Shadow pressed his paw against a crooked drawer, built into the base of a cabinet. His claws scraped against wood swollen by years of damp. "Something's in there," Raphael said, his eyes narrowing. Mark shifted his weight, watching as Emily tugged at the drawer. It resisted at first, stuck fast with rust and ice. Shadow barked once, low and urgent, before biting the edge and pulling. The wood cracked, breaking free with a groan that echoed in the still cabin. Inside was a scattering of relics from another time. Emily reached in carefully, pulling out a lantern, its glass fogged with grime, the metal frame flecked with rust. She turned it in her hands, eyes widening as she realized it was still intact. Beneath it lay two flares, wrapped in old oilcloth, their red casings dulled but recognizable. And then, beneath the flares, a bundle of papers, tied with a strip of leather. The pages were brittle, edges browned with age. Emily set them gently on the floor, untying the strap with careful fingers. The diary inside smelled of dust and smoke. Its cover was cracked, initials carved faintly into the leather. A.C. Emily ran her finger across the letters, frowning slightly. A.C., she whispered. "Who's that?" Raphael crouched beside her, squinting at the faded writing. "Whoever he was, he lived here, maybe 50 years ago." He flipped a page, eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. "Looks like a logger, notes about storms, hunting." Then something about disappearances. His jaw tightened. Men gone missing in these woods. Not an accident, if you ask me. Mark's gaze lingered on the initials. His soldier's mind catalogued every detail. The lantern, the flares, the diary, as if they were pieces of evidence in a case not yet solved. His leg throbbed, but he couldn't ignore the chill that crawled deeper than the cold air. "This place has history," he murmured, "and not the kind that ends well." Emily held the lantern closer, her small hands brushing dust from its glass. "It still works," she said quietly, as if willing it to be true. Her voice carried hope where the men's carried only suspicion. Raphael found a box of matches wedged deep in the drawer. He struck one against the cabinet, the flame sputtering to life, warm and fragile. Emily lifted the lantern, and together they coaxed it to burn. Light filled the cabin, weak, yellow, but enough to push the shadows back. For the first time since the truck, they weren't swallowed in darkness. Kyle stirred, eyes fluttering open at the glow. His breathing was still shallow, but steadier. Emily moved back to his side, placing the lantern near him, her presence illuminated by the flickering light. She covered him with an old, moth-eaten blanket she had pulled from a trunk in the corner. Shadow lay down by the door, nose pressed against the gap, eyes unblinking. His ears twitched with every moan of the storm, every crack of snow falling from the roof. Guarding. Waiting. Mark's gaze lingered on Emily as she settled the lantern near Kyle. Her shadow stretched long against the wooden walls, small and fragile, yet impossibly strong. In her hands, relics of the past had become instruments of survival. For a moment, the cabin felt less like a ruin and more like a sanctuary, but only for a moment. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sound none of them wanted to acknowledge. Not just the storm. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, crunching in the snow. Shadow's head lifted instantly, his growl vibrating low in his chest. The cabin may have given them shelter, but it had also made them a target. And whatever history lingered in these woods, it was not finished with them yet. The cabin creaked under the weight of the storm, its walls trembling as if they might collapse at any moment. Wind clawed at the boards, rattling the broken shutters, but inside, the silence was broken only by ragged breathing and the occasional cough. The air was colder than stone, seeping into their bones. Rafael Torres, though the others called him Ben when the weight of rank fell away, dragged a few logs from a corner where they had been stacked decades earlier. They were damp, swollen with years of frost and neglect. He dropped them onto the floor with a thud, his breath steaming. "These won't burn easy," he muttered, striking one against the wall to knock off the rot. "But they're all we've got." Mark leaned against the remnants of a chair, his injured legs stretched out, eyes following every movement. His skin was pale under the soot, sweat chilling on his forehead. Each breath was labored, but his mind remained sharp, watching, calculating. Emily moved quietly through the shadows, carrying the lantern she had coaxed to life. The soft glow traced her small frame, her hair matted with snow, her cheeks still flushed from the cold. She crouched beside Raphael, her voice soft but certain. "If you peel away the wet bark, the inside might catch." Raphael raised a brow but didn't question her. He pulled his knife, stripping the outer layer until pale wood showed beneath. He struck a match, shielding the flame with his hands. At first it sputtered, smoke curling uselessly, but then a thin flame caught, licking up the dry fibers. He leaned in, coaxing it, feeding it with shredded paper from the diary's empty back pages, and the brittle remnants of kindling found under the cot. The flame grew reluctantly, smoke swirling through the cabin before finding escape through the cracked roof. Slowly, heat seeped into the room. Emily sat cross-legged near the fire, her hands held out carefully. She didn't rush. She let the warmth touch her slowly, as if afraid too much at once might burn. Her eyes reflected the flames, flickering between exhaustion and something deeper, an old, quiet resilience. Kyle lay bundled in the moth-eaten blanket she had found earlier. His face was ghostly pale, lips still tinged blue, but his breathing had steadied. Emily rose without a word, walked to him, and tucked the blanket tighter around his shoulders. She brushed his hair back from his forehead the way a mother might, though she was only a child herself. Raphael watched her for a long moment, then glanced at Mark. The sergeant's usual hardness cracked for a second, his voice low. "Kid's tougher than most recruits I've seen." Mark didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on Emily's fragile frame, the way her small hands moved with instinct, caring for the rookie with quiet devotion. Against the firelight, she looked impossibly small, her coat hanging off her like it belonged to someone else. Yet every move she made carried purpose. She wasn't just surviving, she was keeping them alive. Shadow curled by the door, his body pressed against the gap at the bottom where cold air leaked in. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his eyes never closed. His ears twitched at every gust of wind, every shifting groan of the cabin. He refused to rest, his body coiled like a spring. Guarding them wasn't a duty. It was his existence. Mark's throat tightened as he watched the scene. The fire snapped and crackled, the first real warmth they had felt since the ambush. Kyle's shallow breaths steadied under Emily's care. Raphael leaned back against the wall, fatigue carving lines into his face but relief softening them. And in the center of it all sat the girl, her hands stretched toward the flames, her shoulders squared against the storm outside. She shouldn't have been there. She shouldn't have been anywhere near this nightmare of betrayal, fire, and blood. And yet, she was the only reason they had survived the burning truck. She was the one who had steadied Kyle, bandaged Mark's wound, found light in the darkness of the cabin. Mark realized, with a heaviness that sank deep into his bones, that their fate no longer depended on their training, their rank, or their weapons. It depended on her, and on the scarred shepherd who watched over her with the intensity of a guardian angel forged in fur and scars. He whispered it more to himself than to anyone else, the words almost lost in the crackle of the fire. She may be the only hope we've got. Emily glanced up, meeting his eyes as if she had heard. For a heartbeat she looked older than her years, as though she understood the weight that had settled on her small shoulders. She didn't speak. She only turned back to the fire, her hands steady against the flames. Outside, the storm raged, battering the cabin as if determined to tear it apart. But inside, in that fragile circle of warmth and light, something stronger than the storm began to take root. Not victory, not safe, but trust. Thin, tentative, fragile as the first flame on damp wood. And trust, Mark thought, was enough to keep men alive in the darkest places. The fire crackled weakly in the corner, its glow bending shadows across the cabin walls. The warmth was fragile, fragile enough that every gust of wind rattling through the gaps threatened to snuff it out. But for a moment, the room felt survivable, until Kyle's breathing turned ragged again. At first, Mark thought it was just fatigue. The rookie had taken in more smoke than the rest of them, and his body had been battered in the crash. But then, Kyle's breaths came faster, shallow gasps that scraped against his throat like broken glass. His chest heaved violently, his eyes wide, darting around the cabin as though the flames of the truck had followed them here. No, I can't. His voice cracked, trembling with terror. His hands clawed at the blanket Emily had wrapped him in, shoving it aside as if it were strangling him. Raphael knelt beside him, gripping his shoulders. Easy, Jensen. You're safe. You're not in the truck anymore. But Kyle didn't hear him. His mind was somewhere else, still trapped in the burning wreck, still tasting the poison of the smoke. His breaths came faster, spiraling into a frantic rhythm that no soldier's voice could break. Mark tried to push himself upright, ignoring the agony in his leg. He's hyperventilating. He'll pass out if he doesn't. He stopped, coughing against the dust. His body simply couldn't rise to the moment. Emily moved before either of them could. She slipped down beside Kyle, her small frame dwarfed by his trembling body. Without hesitation, she took his hand in both of hers. Her grip was steady, warm, grounding. She pressed her forehead lightly against his knuckles, as though anchoring him by touch alone. "Kyle," she said softly, her voice threading through the panic like a needle through cloth. "Listen to me. You're not in the fire. You're here. With us. With Shadow." Kyle's chest still convulsed, his breaths harsh, but his wild eyes flickered toward her. The sound of her voice didn't match the storm or the fire. It was softer, clearer, untouched by fear. She began to speak, whispering stories, not about survival or soldiers or battles, but about small, ordinary things. "When I was little," she murmured, "I used to sit under a big oak tree near my grandma's house. In summer, the branches would make shade so big it felt like the whole world disappeared. I would close my eyes and pretend I was invisible, safe." Her words painted pictures that had nothing to do with the terror choking him. There was a swing, too. It creaked every time the wind blew, like it was talking to me. And I'd stay there until the stars came out, counting them one by one. Kyle's gasps stuttered, uneven but slowing. His eyes, once darting, now fixed on her face. Shadow padded closer, pressing his muzzle against Kyle's chest. The shepherd's weight was solid, grounding, his warm breath puffing against the rookie's uniform. He nudged once, firmly, then again, as if to say, "Here, with me, breathe." Kyle's trembling hands found Shadow's fur. His fingers curled into the thick coat, clinging like a drowning man to driftwood. The dog didn't move away. He only leaned harder, steady as a stone, until Kyle's breaths began to fall into rhythm with his own. "In through your nose," Emily whispered, matching the rise of Shadow's chest. "Out through your mouth, slow, like this. Do it with me." She exaggerated the motion, pulling air deep into her lungs, then letting it out in a long, steady stream. Shadow's breathing filled the silence, a metronome of life. Kyle mimicked them, shaky at first, then stronger. The panic ebbed, retreating like a tide. His chest slowed, his eyes blinked, his body softened against the floorboards. He clutched Emily's hand in one fist, Shadow's fur in the other, tethered by the smallest anchors in the room. Raphael exhaled heavily, relief etched across his face. A kid stronger than he knows. Mark leaned back, watching with a mixture of awe and something deeper, heavier. The child who had dragged them from the fire, who had bandaged his wound, was now steadying the youngest member of his team with nothing but words and presence. The smallest of them was becoming the strongest anchor. Emily didn't let go. Even when Kyle's breathing steadied into normal rhythm, she brushed his hair back from his forehead, her voice fading into a whisper. "See? You're safe now. You're here. With us." Kyle's lips moved around the words, broken and faint. "Thank you." She gave the smallest nod, her face lit by the firelight, fragile, yet unshaken. Shadow curled tighter against Kyle's side, head resting on his chest, as though to ensure his breathing stayed even. His ears twitched, still alert, but his eyes softened, glowing amber in the flicker of the fire. For a long moment, the storm outside disappeared. There was only this: a rookie soldier who had almost drowned in panic, a dog who refused to let him, and a child whose voice had guided him back. Mark Ellison swallowed hard, his eyes lingering on Emily. He thought of his daughter, the one he had lost years before, and how she, too, had been small, but impossibly strong. His throat tightened, but he forced the words out, almost a vow. "We follow her lead," he whispered, not to Raphael, not even to Kyle, but to himself. "Because she's the reason we're still breathing." The fire snapped, shadows danced, and in that ruined cabin on a mountain buried in snow, 3 soldiers realized their hope rested not in their training, nor their rank, nor their guns. It rested in a girl and her dog. The cabin had settled into uneasy stillness. The fire sputtered low in the hearth, its smoke curling lazily through the cracks in the ceiling beams. Kyle's breathing had steadied, his chest rising and falling with Shadow's rhythmic weight pressed against him. For a moment, it seemed the storm outside might keep them hidden, its howling curtain drawn across the mountain. But then Shadow stiffened, and his head snapped toward the door, ears pricked, his entire body freezing mid-breath. The growl began deep in his chest, low, vibrating, primal. His hackles rose like a ridge of bristles, his amber eyes narrowing at the space beneath the door. Emily, curled close to him, felt the tension ripple through his body. Without hesitation, she pressed one small hand into his fur, holding tight, not to restrain him, but to steady herself. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply watched him, trusting his instincts more than the men's weapons or training. Mark sat up, wincing at the flare of pain in his thigh. He knew that sound. A dog didn't growl like that because of the wind or creaking wood. That was the growl of recognition. "Something's out there," he said hoarsely. Raphael, Ben to the ones who knew him best, moved to the wall and crouched low, scanning the room. His eyes landed on a sliver of light where two planks had warped apart. He dropped to his knees and pressed his face close, peering through the crack into the storm. At first, he saw nothing, just snow tumbling across the clearing. Then movement. A dark shadow cutting across the white. Another. His breath caught. Boots. Tactical. Heavy tread, designed for grip in ice. Not hikers. Not hunters. Men who moved with purpose. He leaned closer. The prints in the snow weren't random. They circled, slow and deliberate, arcing around the cabin like predators testing the cage. Whoever they were, they knew exactly what they were looking for. "Christ," Raphael muttered under his breath. "They found us." Mark's jaw tightened, his worst fear confirmed. The storm hadn't swallowed their trail. Kane's men were out there, sweeping for survivors. "How many?" he asked. Raphael squinted, watching the figures blur in and out of the snow. "At least 3 I can see. Probably more." He pulled back from the crack, his face pale in the flickering firelight. "They're hunting." The word settled like ice in the cabin. Kyle stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open. "What? What is it?" Mark silenced him with a gesture. "Quiet. Save your strength." His gaze slid to Emily. She hadn't moved. Her small fingers were buried in Shadow's fur, clutching tight enough that her knuckles whitened. But her face was set, lips pressed together, her eyes clear. She didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. Her silence carried a weight that made the room itself seem to hold its breath. Shadow growled again, this time louder, his gaze locked on the door. The firelight gleamed off his scars, turning him into something more beast than dog, an ancient guardian who knew danger before it struck. Mark forced himself upright, every nerve in his leg screaming. He braced on the edge of the table, his voice low and sharp. "We can't fight them here. If they rush the door, we're done." Raphael's jaw tightened. "Then what? Run out into that storm with a half-dead rookie and a wounded captain. They'll pick us off." Silence stretched, heavy with dread. The only sound was the storm clawing at the cabin walls, the fire hissing as damp wood spat sparks. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but certain. "Shadow will know." The men turned toward her. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She only stroked the shepherd's neck, her eyes fixed on him as though he were a compass pointing true north. Shadow rose suddenly, pacing to the door. He pressed his nose against the wood, sniffing sharply. then backed away with a bark so loud it rattled the walls. His tail was rigid, his body quivering with tension. "They're close," Mark whispered. Raphael clenched his fists, fighting the instinct to charge out, guns blazing, though he had no gun to blaze with anymore. He glanced at Emily, then at Shadow, then at Mark. "What's the call, Captain?" Mark's mind churned, the soldier in him wrestling with the father buried deep inside. His instincts screamed to protect the child, the one who had saved them, the one who now anchored all of them. "We wait," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "We don't move until we know where they are. Shadow gives the signal. We act." Raphael didn't argue. Not this time. Outside, the crunch of boots grew louder, circling tighter, closing in like wolves. Inside, a girl held her dog's fur and stayed silent, her composure stronger than men twice her age. And in that silence, trust settled heavier than fear. The footsteps outside faded for a moment, swallowed by the storm. But silence in war never meant safety. Silence meant waiting. Hours felt compressed into minutes inside that rotting cabin. The fire had burned low, reduced to glowing embers, and the air hung heavy with smoke and tension. Nobody dared to speak above a whisper. Even Kyle, weak and trembling, kept his lips pressed shut. It was Raphael, ever restless, who finally rose. He crept toward the warped window, his breath fogging against the icy glass. He pressed his face to the crack between planks, scanning the clearing beyond. At first, all he saw was snow and shadow. Then something caught his eye. A faint shape, half buried near the tree line, just visible under the glow of the storm's shifting light. Angular, metallic, not natural. "Captain," Raphael murmured, his voice low but sharp. "There's something out there." Mark forced himself upright despite the pain in his thigh. "Show me." Raphael led him to the window, pointing toward the shape. Mark's stomach sank. It wasn't just a piece of debris. It was too deliberate, too manufactured. He gestured for the others to stay put, then pushed the door open just enough to squeeze through. The wind hit like a wall, slicing into his skin, howling as if to warn him back. Shadow slipped out with him, his paws silent in the snow, ears sharp, nose low to the ground. Emily followed, clinging to the shepherd's harness, despite the cold that bit through her thin coat. "Stay behind me," Mark ordered, though his voice was drowned by the storm. They trudged forward through the drifts, every step weighted with dread. The shape grew clearer. A small craft of composite and carbon fiber, its body cracked and splintered, one wing twisted like broken bone. Snow had half swallowed it, but enough remained to see the truth. A drone. Not the cheap plastic kind sold to hobbyists. This was heavier, built for endurance, with reinforced casing and a camera lens large enough to pierce the storm. The rotor blades were shattered, their edges sharp, but the central body remained intact. On its side, faint beneath ice and ash, was a serial code, military grade. Mark crouched slowly, his legs screaming as he brushed snow away from the surface. His gloved fingers traced the design, every detail a confirmation of his fear. "This isn't civilian," he muttered. "Not even close." Raphael, close behind, cursed under his breath. "Which means whoever's after us isn't freelancing. They're funded. Organized." Emily crouched beside Shadow, her wide eyes reflecting the drone's broken shell. She reached out, touching the cold metal with her fingertips, as though trying to understand why something so small could feel so threatening. Mark turned the machine onto its side, revealing the camera lens, still intact, still staring, blind but menacing. He looked at Raphael, his voice grim. They weren't just chasing us, they were tracking us. The realization dropped like a stone. The ambush hadn't been luck. The men outside weren't stumbling through the storm hoping for a target. This was a hunt planned with precision, guided by eyes in the sky. Raphael's jaw tightened. Cain's fingerprints all over this. Only someone with reach gets toys like these. Emily looked between them, silent, clutching Shadow's fur tighter. She didn't cry, didn't ask what it meant. Her silence was louder than any words, a weight pressing down on all of them. The storm howled louder, as if echoing the truth. They weren't survivors who had slipped through fate's cracks. They were prey, being driven into the open. Mark stood, his hand pressing against his bleeding leg. "We can't stay here. They'll come back for it. And when they do..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The others understood. Shadow suddenly barked, sharp and violent, the sound tearing through the storm like a command. He spun toward the tree line, hackles raised, his body rigid. Everyone froze. The bark wasn't a warning of curiosity. It was a warning of proximity. The kind of bark that said, "They're here." Mark's heart hammered in his chest. He lifted his gaze to the forest beyond, where the branches swayed under frost. Shadows shifted between the trees. Boots crunched faintly in the snow, moving closer, deliberately. The hunters had returned. Raphael's hand twitched toward a weapon he didn't have. Kyle, still weak, clutched the blanket tighter, his eyes wide. Emily pressed herself against Shadow, her grip firm, her face set like stone. Mark bent low, his voice steady, though his pulse thundered. Back inside. Now. Quiet. They moved as one, retreating to the cabin with Shadow backing them step for step, his eyes never leaving the tree line. The broken drone lay in the snow like a confession, proof that what stalked them was more than chance, it was design. And as the cabin door closed behind them, the truth settled heavy on every heart. This wasn't survival against nature. This was survival against men, professionals, hunters. And the storm outside was no longer their greatest threat. Far from the ruined cabin, deep within a hollow carved by pine and frost, a different fire burned. It wasn't the wild, hungry kind that had consumed the pickup. It was controlled, deliberate. A cluster of mercenaries huddled around it, their silhouettes sharp against the snow, rifles slung across their chests, breath steaming in the cold. They didn't speak much. Men like these rarely did. Failure hung heavier than the storm, and they knew what was coming. Victor Cain arrived like a shadow carved out of authority. The ex-police commissioner moved with the kind of presence that didn't need shouting to command fear. His coat was black wool, tailored even for the wilderness, dusted with snow that refused to cling. His face, half lit by the fire, bore lines etched deep from decades of power, abused and unpunished. Arrogance settled into every crease, and beneath it, scars, both literal and unseen. A pale one cut across his jawline, a reminder of a knife fight long buried in his record, one that had mysteriously disappeared when the files were sealed. The mercenaries stiffened as he approached, their laughter dying in their throats. Cain's boots crunched deliberately in the snow, polished leather incongruous against the mud and frost. He didn't dress like them, didn't move like them, but they knew better than to mistake him for anything less dangerous. He stopped by the fire, eyes sweeping the group with disdain. His silence was worse than fury, dragging seconds into eternity, until one of the men cleared his throat. "Commissioner," he began, but Cain's hand snapped up, palm outward, commanding silence without a word. Then his voice came, low and venomous. "You had 3 men tied, gagged, gift-wrapped in a truck with enough gasoline to cremate them 10 times over." His gaze narrowed, each word cutting like a scalpel. And yet, they're still breathing. One of the mercenaries shifted uncomfortably, gloved hands tightening on his rifle strap. Another spat into the snow, as if the ground could swallow the shame. Cain leaned closer to the fire, the glow painting his features into something almost demonic. Do you know what happens when a job isn't finished? When witnesses crawl out of graves you dug for them. He straightened, his voice sharp now, carrying over the storm. It unravels everything. Networks. Deals. The kind of money men like you can't even dream of. The men exchanged uneasy glances. None of them asked what he meant by networks. None dared. Cain took a slow drag from a cigar he lit against the flames. The smoke curled upward, mingling with the storm, carrying the smell of rot and wealth. We are not talking about loose ends in some back alley. We are talking about products, movement, supply chains that stretch farther than these mountains. Do you think men pay millions for silence, only to have it broken by 3 half-dead officers and a stray mutt? The word hung there. Product, casual, cold, deliberate. He didn't say what it meant. He didn't have to. Every man present knew. Human lives, bought and sold. Cain exhaled smoke, the ember glowing in his hand. And now, because you couldn't handle one simple fire, I am forced to waste time. His eyes hardened into steel. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to sweep these woods. Every ridge, every hollow, every God-forsaken tree. You will flush them out before sunrise, or I'll leave your bodies in the snow to feed the crows. The mercenaries nodded stiffly, fear slicing deeper than the cold. One man, braver or stupider than the rest, muttered, "The storm's making it hard, sir. Tracks are covered in minutes." Cain turned his head slowly, as if savoring the defiance. He stepped closer, his polished boots sinking into the snow until he was inches away. His smile was thin, humorless. Storms cover tracks, yes, but storms also kill, which means if you fail to find them, nature will. And if by some miracle they survive both, then I will handle them myself. The man dropped his gaze instantly. Cain flicked his cigar into the snow, the ember hissing out with a curl of smoke. Move. Now. Sweep east first. They'll be looking for higher ground. The mercenaries scattered with military precision, boots crunching into the night, weapons ready. The fire dimmed as snow swallowed it, leaving Cain standing alone in the hollow. For a moment, his mask slipped. His jaw tightened, his hands flexed, and in his eyes flickered something beyond arrogance. Fear. Not of the storm, not of the men. Fear of exposure. Of an empire collapsing if 3 broken soldiers, a child and a dog, lived long enough to speak. He adjusted his coat, tugged his gloves tighter, and muttered under his breath, "Not this time. No one crawls out. Not again." Then he turned, following the trail his men had carved, his shadow stretching long against the snow. The storm had shifted again, less a blanket now than a veil, thinning just enough to reveal the jagged ridges of the mountain. The woods groaned under the weight of snow, every tree bent low, branches heavy with ice. For the 4 survivors, the world had narrowed to one path, the narrow tracks cut long ago by deer that threaded invisibly through the pines. Shadow found it first. The shepherd's nose dipped low, his breath steaming as he padded forward with deliberate steps. His paws sank into the snow with ease, tracing a trail invisible to human eyes. His ears twitched at every creak of the forest, his tail stiff, his whole frame a compass drawn toward safety. Emily clung to his harness, her mittened hands gripping tightly as though tethered to life itself. But she didn't just follow. Half the time, it seemed as if she were guiding him too, her small body leaning, her voice whispering, subtle cues that steered them as if she and Shadow shared a language no one else could hear. Behind them, Mark limped heavily, each step a war. His thigh burned where the shrapnel wound bled under the scarf Emily had tied hours before. Every motion sent agony lancing through him, but he refused to stop. Stopping meant death. His breath came in ragged bursts, fogging into the storm. But his eyes never left Emily's back, the small figure pulling them all forward. "Captain." Raphael's voice carried low, worried. "You're losing too much." "I'll lose more if I stop," Mark ground out, jaw clenched against the pain. Emily turned, her eyes wide but steady. She moved closer to Mark, her small hand reaching out. "Shadow says, keep moving," she whispered, voice soft but firm, as though repeating an order that came from the dog himself. Mark met her gaze, and, for reasons he couldn't explain, felt strength seep back into his legs. He nodded once, forcing his weight forward. "Then we move." The forest pressed in around them, branches heavy with snow, the air thick with silence broken only by the crunch of boots and the whisper of wind. But then, a crack, distant but unmistakable. The echo of a gunshot rolled through the trees. Everyone froze. Kyle stiffened, clutching at Raphael's arm, his eyes wide. "They're close." Another shot rang out, farther this time, followed by the faint, muffled shouts of men. The mercenaries were sweeping the woods in lines, firing into the storm, probing for movement. Shadow growled low in his throat, hackles rising, then pushed forward with urgency. Emily tightened her grip on his harness, her legs working double to keep pace. "They're driving us," Raphael muttered, scanning the trees, "pushing us into a funnel." Mark's mind raced, calculating routes, recalling maps he'd studied before the mission. If Kane's men were sweeping east like he suspected, the deer trails might be the only way to slip between their lines. But it was narrow, risky. One wrong step, and they'd be surrounded. Another gunshot cracked, closer this time, splintering wood. Snow fell from the branches overhead, showering them in white. "Move," Mark hissed. They pushed harder, stumbling through drifts that swallowed their boots. Raphael kept one hand on Kyle's back, shoving him forward when his legs threatened to buckle. Mark limped, but drove himself on sheer will. And always ahead of them, Emily and Shadow carved the path. The girl's small voice whispering encouragement that sounded less like comfort and more like orders meant for soldiers. "You're okay. Just one more step." Shadow says faster. Shadow says, "Don't look back." The storm swallowed her words, but the men heard them and obeyed. The forest seemed alive with echoes now, gunfire bouncing between the trees, voices shouting, boots crunching closer. The mercenaries were disciplined, moving in a sweep, their line tightening with every minute. Shadow stopped suddenly, nose darting side to side. He barked once, sharp, then lunged left, pulling Emily with him down a barely visible slope. The ground dropped into a narrow gully, sheltered by boulders and twisted roots. It was almost invisible from above, buried in shadow and snow. Emily stumbled but didn't let go, her grip on the harness dragging her into the hollow with him. "Here," she called, her voice breaking through the storm. Mark and Raphael followed, dragging Kyle between them. They slid into the gully, snow spraying around them, their bodies crashing against frozen earth. For a moment, silence reclaimed the woods. Above, boots crunched past. Shadows of men moved between the trees, rifles at the ready, scanning the forest floor. Their shouts carried fragments of orders, clipped and cold. North Ridge clear. No tracks here. They can't have gone far. Emily pressed herself against Shadow's side, her hand buried deep in his fur. The shepherd lay still, every muscle tense, ears pinned flat, his growl vibrating silently in his chest. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears. He gritted his teeth against the pain in his leg, his hand gripping his sidearm, empty, useless. For the first time in years, he realized how powerless he was without the rifle that had once defined his life. The footsteps lingered overhead. Then, slowly, they moved on, swallowed again by the storm. Only when silence stretched long and thin did Shadow lift his head, ears twitching, nose testing the air. He gave a single sharp bark, a command, not a question. Emily nodded as though she understood. She looked back at the men, her face pale but determined. Shadow says it's safe, for now. No one questioned her. Not Raphael, not Kyle, not even Mark. They just followed. And as they crawled deeper into the gully, the storm pressing down, one truth gnawed at Mark's thoughts. They were not just being chased. They were being herded. Driven like prey. And somewhere behind those gunshots, Victor Kane was tightening the noose. The gully carried them deeper into the woods, its floor narrowing into a winding path of stone and ice. The storm above was muffled here, muted by the steep walls, but that silence brought no peace. It only made the sound of their boots louder, each crunch a reminder that they were prey in another man's territory. Shadow led the way, nose low, ears flicking, his body taut with instinct. Emily clung to his harness, her small steps quick to keep pace, her eyes darting to every shadow that moved. Behind them, Mark pressed on with his limp, jaw locked, Raphael steadying Kyle when his strength faltered. Then Shadow froze. His body went rigid, hackles rising. A growl rumbled low in his chest, not toward the trees this time, but at the ground itself. He stepped sideways sharply, pulling Emily with him. "Wait," Mark hissed, his voice sharp. Raphael squinted into the snow ahead and saw it. A wire, thin, almost invisible, stretched taut across the gully floor. Just high enough to catch a leg, just loose enough to look like nothing at all. Beyond it, half buried under branches and snow, was a pit lined with sharpened stakes, their tips black with rust. "Jesus," Raphael muttered. "Snare traps. Military grade." Emily's breath caught. If Shadow hadn't pulled her aside, her small frame would have been the first to fall. She tightened her grip on his fur, her face pale, but her eyes steady. They moved slower now, every step measured. Shadow prowled ahead, testing the snow before each pace. Twice more he stopped, barking sharply at wires strung between trees, their ends anchored to crude but deadly devices hidden beneath the drifts. The woods themselves had been turned into weapons. Mark's chest burned with anger. This wasn't just pursuit, it was extermination. Kane's men weren't chasing them. They were pushing them through a killing field laid out in advance. Then it happened. Shadow leapt over a drift, landing heavy. The snow gave way beneath him with a metallic snap. A trap clamped shut around his front paw, teeth of rusted steel biting deep into flesh. His yelp cut through the woods like a gunshot. "Shadow!" Emily cried, her voice breaking. The dog thrashed once, twice, muscles bulging as the iron jaws held him. Blood stained the snow, steaming in the cold. His teeth bared, His growl turning savage, he pulled again, harder, until the rusted hinge shrieked. With one final surge of strength, he wrenched his paw free. The trap snapped shut on nothing, its springs shattered. But Shadow's paw was torn, blood dripping steadily into the snow. Emily dropped to her knees beside him, tears blurring her vision. Her hands shook as she pulled off the scarf from her neck, the one she had worn since they found her. She pressed it against the wound, her small fingers trembling as they tried to hold pressure. "Don't move," she whispered, though her voice cracked. "You'll be okay. You have to be okay." Shadow panted, his chest heaving, but he didn't resist. He lowered his head, resting it against her knee, as though trusting her completely, despite the pain. His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching, loyal. Mark staggered forward, his wound screaming, but he stopped short when he saw Emily. The way she pressed her scarf against Shadow's paw, the way she fought back sobs to keep her hands steady. She wasn't just comforting him, she was saving him. Raphael crouched nearby, scanning the tree line, his jaw tight. "We can't linger. If they hear that cry, then we fight." Mark cut him off, his voice harsh. He looked back at Emily, softer now. "How bad is it?" Emily didn't look up. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "It's bleeding a lot, but he's strong. He can still walk." The scarf darkened quickly with blood, but she didn't loosen her grip. Not once. Kyle, pale and shaking, whispered hoarsely, She's doing better than I could." Raphael nodded grimly. "Better than most medics I've seen." Emily finally looked up, her cheeks streaked with tears. But there was no fear in her eyes, only resolve. "We can't leave him. He saved me. He saves all of us." Mark met her gaze and felt a weight settle on his chest. Not the crushing burden of command, but the humbling realization that their hope was tied to the courage of a child. "No one's leaving him," he said quietly. "Not now. Not ever." Shadow shifted, pressing his wounded paw carefully against the snow. He winced, but stood, leaning into Emily's side. She kept her hand on his harness, steadying him. The group moved forward again, slower than before, every step haunted by the sight of blood on white snow. The traps still waited, hidden and merciless, but they walked with sharper eyes now, trusting not the ground beneath them, but the shepherd who had already bled for them. And though Emily's tears froze against her cheeks, she did not cry out. Her silence, heavy and unshaken, carried more weight than any soldier's vow. The storm had clawed the day into night without warning. The forest was black now, broken only by the pallid light of the moon filtering through torn clouds. Snow fell in heavy sheets, erasing the world behind them with every step. Their tracks vanished almost as quickly as they made them, but Mark knew Kane's men were close. Shadow limped ahead, his wounded paw leaving faint streaks of blood. Emily stayed tight at his side, her hand pressed firmly to his harness, guiding him now as much as he guided her. Her scarf was gone, wrapped around Shadow's paw, but she never complained. Mark stumbled again, nearly falling. His thigh screamed with every step. Raphael caught his arm, steadying him, though both men knew he couldn't last long in the open. "We need cover," Raphael muttered. "Anything." A cave, a ridge, even a ditch. As if answering, Shadow slowed. His ears pricked, nose pressed to the ground. Suddenly, he veered left, toward a cluster of boulders at the ridge's base. Emily tugged at his harness. He found something. They followed through deep drifts until the rocks loomed overhead, jagged teeth rising from the earth. Shadow nosed at the base of a boulder, then vanished into darkness, beneath the ledge. Emily dropped to her knees. It's hollow. Big enough. Raphael cleared snow away to reveal the entrance. A shallow cave, low-ceilinged and damp, carved by centuries of wind and ice. Cramped, but hidden. To anyone above it, would look like nothing but shadow and drift. One by one, they crawled inside. The storm muffled instantly, reduced to a distant howl. The cold stone bit their palms, the air thick with damp. But it was a shelter. Raphael collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. Kyle slumped beside him, pale but calmer now that the wind was gone. Mark lowered himself carefully, his injured leg stretched out before him, blood seeping through makeshift bandages. Emily curled against Shadow, wrapping her arms around his neck. The shepherd leaned into her as though she were keeping him alive. His amber eyes stayed open, scanning the entrance. Mark watched them in silence, pain dulled by something heavier, memory. His daughter had been Emily's age when the sickness came, 7 years old. Fragile hands, a laugh that shattered his hardest days. He remembered nights at her bedside, telling stories about heroes and angels, promising her the world outside her hospital room would wait. He remembered her hand in his, small, warm, trusting, until the day it wasn't anymore. The memory is cut like glass. He had buried it for years beneath rank, duty, and bourbon. But here, in the hollow, it rose unbidden. Emily pressed against Shadow's scarred flank was like looking through time. His throat closed. He had no words. Only grief, raw and unrelenting. Emily looked up as though she could feel the weight of his gaze. Her eyes met his, clear, steady, far older than her years. She didn't speak, but her silence carried the same reminder his daughter once gave him, what it meant to keep fighting when fighting seemed impossible. Raphael shifted. We'll have to move before dawn. They'll sweep this ridge. Mark nodded numbly. For now, we rest. Shadow needs it. So do we. Emily whispered into the dog's fur, words too soft to hear, but they steadied his trembling muscles. The storm raged above, erasing every trace of their passage. But inside, pressed together in the narrow dark, 4 soldiers and a child breathed as one. For the first time since the ambush, Mark allowed himself to believe they might still have a chance. Hours passed. The hollow was dark, moonlight leaking through cracks in the rock. The storm outside roared like a living beast, but inside it was still, broken only by shallow breaths. Shadow lay at the cave's mouth, head resting on his uninjured paw. Emily clung to him even in sleep, her whispers fading into half-formed dreams. Mark sat apart, leg throbbing, but he couldn't look away from the dog. His scars caught the light. One, jagged and pale across the neck, looked years old. Not from this fight. Older, deeper. Mark leaned forward, breath catching. His fingers brushed it lightly. Memory struck. Years ago, another storm, another ruin. Afghanistan, Kunduz. A collapsed building, civilians buried beneath stone, soldiers digging with bare hands. He remembered the dust choking the air, the chaos. And the dog. A shepherd, half dead, trapped under rubble beside a pinned boy. Mark had clawed until his hands bled, dragging both free. The boy hadn't survived. But the dog, yes. The dog had lain trembling across his chest. Mark had stroked his neck, right over that scar, whispering, "You're safe now. I've got you." The world blurred. Mark's hand dropped, his throat closing. Tears burned unbidden. "It's you," he whispered. "All these years. It's you." Shadow lifted his head slowly, amber eyes locking on him. For a moment, silence stretched. Then the shepherd limped forward and pressed his head against Mark's chest, exactly as he had once done in that dust-filled ruin. Mark's body broke. His arms folded around the dog, face buried in fur that smelled of smoke and snow. Tremors of Shadow's breath steadied him, grounding him in recognition. "You remember," Mark whispered, voice breaking. "After everything, you remember." Emily stirred, blinking in the dim light. She saw Mark clutching Shadow, as though holding a ghost, the dog resting against him with quiet certainty. She said nothing. Her eyes softened, understanding some reunions need no words. Raphael turned his face away, giving them silence, though his throat tightened. Kyle stirred briefly, a faint smile touching his lips, before exhaustion claimed him again. Mark held the shepherd tighter, memories colliding with the present, until he could hardly breathe. His daughter's face flickered in his mind, laughing, lost. Then the dog's steady eyes, unyielding. Both reminders of what he had lost, both of what still remained. It wasn't a coincidence, not a chance. In a world that had stolen so much, some things found their way back. When at last he released his grip, Shadow stayed pressed against him, head on his chest like an oath renewed. "You saved me once," Mark whispered. "Maybe you're here to save me again." The shepherd's tail thumped once against the stone, soft but certain. And in that hollow, a reunion unfolded, not of soldiers or fugitives, but of two souls who had carried one another through fire before, and would again. Time passed. The cave air grew heavier, each breath misting white. Emily slept against Shadow's side, hand tangled in his fur. Raphael sat guard, eyes half shut but alert. Kyle's breathing steadied beneath the blanket. The cave held them fragile, but unbroken. It was Mark who finally spoke. His voice was raw, cutting through the stillness. "No one gets left behind." He swallowed, gaze locked on the girl curled against the dog. "Not this child, not this dog, not while I'm breathing." The oath wasn't shouted, wasn't polished. It was forged in pain and memory, and that made it unshakable. Raphael opened his eyes fully. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He only answered, steady. "Then we stand by it. Together." Kyle stirred weakly, voice faint but clear. "I agree." Mark's gaze moved between them. They were no longer three officers dragging themselves through snow with a child and a wounded dog. They were something else now. A family bound by survival and vow. Emily stirred at the sound. Her eyes opened, heavy with sleep. "Promise?" she whispered. Mark's chest tightened. "Promise." Satisfied, she pressed her face back into Shadow's fur. Silence returned, until a new sound broke it. Crunch. Boots in snow. Close. Every muscle tensed. Shadow's ears shot up, body coiling, but he didn't bark. A low growl rumbled in his chest, meant only for them. Raphael crawled to the gap beneath the ledge. A faint beam of light cut through the storm, sweeping across the snow. Another followed. Flashlights. Voices drifted with the wind, clipped and professional. Tracks. Near here. Spread out. Check every shadow. Mark's pulse hammered. Kane's men. The sweep had reached them. Emily clutched Shadow tighter, but she didn't cry out. Her silence was heavier than any scream. Shadow lay still, his growl fading, his chest rising against hers. Raphael pulled back, whispering. Half a dozen. Circling. Mark's voice was steady, though every nerve screamed. We don't move. Not until they're gone. The light swept closer, lingering near the ledge. Shadows danced across the ceiling. For a breathless moment, it seemed certain the mercenaries would see the entrance, storm the cave. But the beam drifted on, swallowed by snow. Voices grew fainter, moving farther up the ridge. Only when silence returned did anyone breathe. Mark leaned his head back against the stone, trembling with both pain and relief. His gaze fell again on Emily and Shadow, two fragile silhouettes pressed together. His vow echoed, softer this time, spoken only to himself. No one gets left behind. And in the hollow's darkness, the words bound them tighter than chains. Dawn never truly broke on the mountain. The storm swallowed the horizon, leaving only a dim grey light that bled through the snow, enough to show shapes, not warmth. Through the veil of white, a silhouette rose against the ridge, an abandoned fire lookout tower. Its steel legs stabbed the ridge like bones, rusted and skeletal. The cabin at the top leaned slightly, windows shattered, roof sagging under years of frost. It looked more like a ruin than a refuge, but to the survivors it was a beacon. Mark stared at it, his chest heaving. His thigh was aflame, every step since the cave tearing the wound wider, but the sight of the tower sent something fragile through him. Hope. We can make it, he rasped. From there, we'll get a signal out. Raphael eyed the leaning structure. If the stairs hold. They'll hold long enough, Mark said. He had to believe it. The climb began. The ridge was steep, snow slick beneath their boots, each step threatening to send them sliding back. Raphael went first, half-hauling Kyle. Mark limped behind, fists clenched against the pain. Emily pressed forward between them all, hand tight on Shadow's harness. The shepherd limped, but never faltered, guiding her, guiding them all. Spots of blood trailed his paw, yet he pressed on. Halfway up, Emily stumbled. She crumpled into the snow, chest heaving. Mark staggered toward her, panic rising. But Shadow was there first. The shepherd nudged her shoulder hard, barked once, sharp, commanding. He pressed his body against hers until she rose again. Tears streaked her face, but she clutched his harness tighter. Okay. I'm okay. We'll keep going. Step by step, Shadow pushed her forward, trembling paw steady as steel. Raphael glanced back. That kid's stronger than all of us. Mark said nothing. His throat was too tight. His daughter's face flickered again in his mind, overlapping with Emily until he could hardly separate them. Gunfire cracked faintly in the distance, Kane's men still sweeping below. The sound drove them harder. At last the ridge leveled. The tower loomed directly overhead, legs rising like rusted pillars. Its spiral stairs swayed in the wind, skeletal and narrow. Kyle collapsed to his knees. Raphael hauled him up. Not here. Not now. Emily lifted her chin. Her face was pale, but her words were steady. We made it. Mark steadied her shoulder. He looked up at the tower and whispered, "That is hope." The steel groaned as they climbed. Stairs whined, snow whipped their faces, the whole structure swaying like the ribs of a dead giant. At the top, the door hung crooked. Raphael shoved it open with a shriek of rust. Inside was colder than out, the air stale with rot. Splintered floorboards, broken windows, a sagging desk, ruin. But in the corner, beneath a frost-stiff tarp, lay a battered radio. Wires tangled like veins, casing rusted. Silent, waiting. Raphael dragged it into the open, hands already moving. If this thing's got any life... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. This was their only chance. Mark lowered himself into a chair, legs screaming. Kyle slumped against the wall, shivering. Emily stood at the window, arms wrapped around Shadow, eyes wide on Raphael's hands. The first sound was a shriek of static, loud enough to make Emily flinch. Raphael twisted knobs, fine-tuned, swore under his breath. Static rose, fell, rose again. "Come on, give me something." Minutes dragged like hours. The storm howled through broken panes. The frame rattled under the wind. Then, a crackle, a faint voice beneath the static. "Copy. Frequency. Identify." Raphael's head snapped up. "I've got something." Mark leaned forward, pulse hammering. "Lock it in." The voice sharpened into fragments. "Emergency channel. Identify coordinates." Raphael snatched the transmitter. "This is Sergeant Rafael Torres, U.S. Army. Survivors of ambush, Mount Constantine. Request immediate extraction." Static hissed, then faintly, "Coordinates. Say again." "The storm's killing it," Raphael muttered. Mark forced himself upright. "Give them a landmark." The tower. Raphael pressed the button again, voice raw. "At abandoned Constantine fire lookout, Ridge 3, 3 officers, 1 minor, K9. Immediate medevac required." Silence. Wind screamed. Then, through the static, "Copy. Fire, lookout. Helicopter, en route. ETA 60 minutes. The words cut like a blade. Relief crashed through them. Raphael sagged back, chest heaving. Emily blinked, lips parting. They heard us?" "They heard us," Raphael said. For the first time since the night began, Emily smiled. Small, fragile, hesitant, but real. She bent to Shadow, whispering, "We're going home." The shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor, certain. Mark watched her smile. His chest tightened, memories of his daughter rising again. But this time they didn't crush him. They gave him strength. For a moment, the tower felt alive again. The promise of rescue echoed louder than the storm outside. They only had to hold out an hour. The first sound was shattering glass. A window burst inward, shards flying like frozen rain. The wind screamed through the opening, carrying the stutter of automatic gunfire. "Down!" Raphael roared, throwing himself across Kyle as bullets ripped through the walls. Splinters exploded, the desk shuddering. Emily screamed once, then dove under the desk with Shadow, clutching his neck. The shepherd crouched low, teeth bared, growl vibrating through the floorboards like thunder. Mark pushed upright, leg aflame, pistol in hand, half empty, barely reliable. He fired as a black-clad figure burst through the window, rifle raised. The shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him back, but more poured in. Gunfire turned the air into chaos. Shouts, splinters, gunpowder mixing with dust and snow. Raphael roared, swinging a chair leg into a mercenary's jaw. Another rifle muzzle swung toward him, then the door slammed open. Victor Kane stepped inside, not dressed for battle. Black coat immaculate, gloves clean, face sharp with a sneer more venomous than any bullet. In his hand, a pistol gleamed, steady. "You should have burned the truck," he said coldly. The words froze the room. Even the mercenaries hesitated. Emily clutched Shadow tighter, burying her face in his fur. The shepherd growled so deep, it shook the desk. Mark's jaw clenched, pistol wavering. Pain blurred his vision, but Kane sharpened everything. The betrayal, the ambush, the years of corruption that had led them here. All of it stood in that doorway, with death in his hand. Raphael spat blood. Kane. The ex-commissioner's smile widened. "Sergeant Torres. Still breathing, I see. A shame. I had such high hopes for that fire." "Why?" Mark was forced out. "Why us?" Kane tilted his head, almost amused. "Because you were in the way. Because some men are meant to vanish quietly in storms. And because I don't leave witnesses." His pistol lifted, leveled at Mark's chest. Emily's whisper broke the silence. "Shadow." The shepherd's muscles coiled, every scarred fiber braced. His growl rose, thunder caged. Kane's smile faltered slightly at the sound. And with the storm howling outside and the promise of rescue still hissing from the radio, the tower became a battlefield. The ambush was no longer outside. It was here, inside their last fragile sanctuary, and survival would cost blood. For one suspended heartbeat, the lookout froze in chaos, Kane in the doorway, pistol raised, mercenaries fanned out behind him, the storm shrieking through shattered glass. Then Shadow moved. The shepherd launched himself like a coiled spring, jaws locking on Kane's wrist with bone-crushing force. The pistol fired once into the ceiling, then skittered across the floorboards as Shadow dragged the arm down with a snarl that drowned out gunfire. Kane roared, his polished composure shattering into raw fury. He staggered, his free hand clawing at the dog's neck. "Get it off me!" The mercenaries surged. Raphael hurled himself into the first, slamming him against the wall, fists and elbows colliding. Mark, bleeding and half-collapsed against the desk, saw the pistol slide across the floor, just out of reach. He dragged himself forward, inch by inch, each movement tearing at his wounded leg. "Shadow!" Emily's scream cut through the storm. Kane had slammed the shepherd against the wall, his arm tightening around Shadow's throat. The dog thrashed, claws raking, but Kane's grip only hardened. His face twisted into rage. "Filthy animal. I'll end you here." Emily bolted from under the desk, throwing herself at him, pounding tiny fists against his arm. "Let him go." Kane swung her aside brutally. She hit the floor hard, crying out, but Shadow's snarl deepened, fighting harder even as his breath failed. Mark's fingers closed on the pistol at last. He dragged it up, trembling from blood loss, but his voice came out like steel. "Kane!" The ex-commissioner turned, sneer curling despite the blood on his wrist. His arm still crushed Shadow's throat. "Go ahead, Captain. Shoot. You'll kill the mutt too." Mark's vision blurred, but his finger tightened on the trigger. He saw Emily's tears, Shadow's scars, his daughter's face flickering in memory. "Then I'll take the shot." For the first time, doubt flickered in Kane's eyes. Shadow seized the opening. With a surge of battered strength, he twisted, teeth snapping again into Kane's arm. Air rushed back into his lungs. Kane cursed, trying to wrench free, but the shepherd clawed and snarled with renewed fury. Emily scrambled up, her voice no longer breaking with fear, but burning with defiance. "Shadow, fight!" The room was chaos incarnate. Fists slamming, rifles cracking, the storm howling through shattered glass. But at its center, the battle narrowed to one truth. Cain choking the dog refusing to yield, Emily crying his name, and Mark crawling through hell with a pistol shaking in his grip. Then Cain dragged Shadow into the line of fire. "Do it," he spat. "Let's see if you'll kill your own." Mark froze. He couldn't risk it. That hesitation nearly broke them. Cain slammed Shadow against the wall again, the dog's growl strangled into silence. Emily screamed. Something snapped in her then, not just terror, but desperate resolve. Her eyes darted to the desk, to the old lantern still sputtering with oil. She seized it in both hands, arms shaking under its weight. "No!" she shrieked and hurled it. The lantern smashed at Cain's feet. Oil spilled, igniting in a burst of orange. Flames leapt, racing across the floor. Heat seared the air, shadows writhing like demons on the walls. Cain staggered back, boots kicking sparks, his hold loosening just enough. Shadow wrenched free, dropping to the floor in a blood-spattered crouch, chest heaving, eyes burning with fury. Mark surged forward, ripping Cain's fallen pistol from the floor. He raised it squarely at Cain's chest. "Drop it." The mercenaries froze as the fire spread, its roar drowning the storm outside. Raphael stood bloodied but unbroken, a rifle ripped from his enemy aimed steady. Kyle, weak but alive, gripped a splintered beam like a spear. And at the center, Mark Ellison, bleeding, limping, unyielding, held Cain in his sights. For the first time, Cain's sneer wavered. Mark's voice was iron. "Order them to stand down." The flames licked higher, smoke thickening. Emily pressed herself against Shadow, her voice clear through the chaos. "Do it, or Shadow finishes what he started." The shepherd bared his teeth, muzzle dripping red, a low growl reverberating through the boards. The sound was judgment. Cain's jaw tightened. At last his voice cut bitterly. "Stand down." One by one, the mercenaries lowered their weapons. Raphael exhaled, relief and rage tangled. About damn time. But the fire wasn't waiting. It devoured the desk, climbed the walls, choking smoke filling the room. Raphael moved quickly, kicking rifles out of reach. His boot caught something half-hidden under charred debris, a leather folder. He snatched it up, flipping it open. Inside lay neat ledgers, photographs, tables of names and codes, shipments, routes, transactions, human lives, catalogued like freight. Children's faces stared from blurred photos, stamped with seals that reeked of official protection. Raphael's voice cracked. "My God. This isn't just mercenaries, it's a network. Trafficking. Children." Mark's stomach turned. His eyes cut to Cain, who only smirked despite blood dripping from his arm. "So you've seen it," he drawled. "Now you understand why you won't leave here alive." Emily lifted her head, eyes wide. "That's why," she whispered. Mark turned to her. "Why what?" Her gaze fixed on Cain, unblinking despite her tears. "That's why I was hurt. Because of him. Because they found out." The silence that followed was heavier than the fire's roar. The ambush wasn't chance. They hadn't just stumbled into a fight. They had uncovered rot. Raphael flipped another page, bile rising in his throat. "There are names, politicians, officers. This goes all the way up." Kyle, pale against the wall, croaked, "We were never meant to survive." The truth struck like ice. This wasn't about soldiers lost in a storm. It was about silence, about burying evidence too dangerous to surface. Mark's grip on the pistol tightened. Kane's sneer widened through the smoke. "You think anyone will believe you?" "A few half-burned papers. Your pawns. This board belongs to me." Emily pressed closer to Shadow, her small voice steady. "He's lying. He's scared." Mark felt her words sink deep. The sneer wasn't strength, it was desperation. The folder in Raphael's hands wasn't just evidence, it was the kind of proof men killed to erase. The fire roared louder, timbers groaning, smoke stinging their eyes. Time was burning fast. Mark's voice dropped, cold as stone. "We don't die here. Not tonight. This doesn't end with you, Kane. It ends with every name in that book." Kane laughed once, sharp and bitter, but it broke into a cough as the smoke clawed his lungs. Emily buried her face into Shadow's fur, whispering through her tears, "We'll make it. We have to." Mark looked at her, then at the folder, then at Kane. For the first time since the ambush, survival wasn't the mission anymore. Exposing the truth was, and it was far bigger than them. The fire lookout was collapsing around them. Flames hissed and popped as beams buckled, smoke pressing thick against the ceiling, choking every breath. The floor groaned, threatening to give way at any moment. There was no time to argue, no time to savor the fragile victory of disarming Kane's men. "Move!" Mark barked, voice ragged but commanding. Raphael and Kyle dragged the mercenaries up from the floor, binding their wrists with torn straps scavenged from gear bags. Coughing, stumbling, their arrogance burned away, the prisoners stumbled toward the door. Kane was last. Mark shoved him forward with the pistol pressed to his back. Kane's once pristine coat was smeared with soot and blood, but he still walked with a swagger, chin high. His eyes, though, kept flicking to the folder tucked under Raphael's arm. The ledgers that had ripped the mask off his empire. They spilled out into the storm. Snow and smoke blurred together, the ridge stretching like a battlefield of ice. Behind them the tower burned, its flames clawing skyward, a beacon for miles, friend or foe. The mercenaries were forced to their knees in the snow, weapons scattered into drifts. Raphael stood behind them, rifle steady. Shadow limped beside Emily, chest heaving, blood dripping from his paw. But he stood tall, eyes fixed on Kane. The dog understood. This man was the source of the storm. Emily sank near a small fire Raphael coaxed from scraps beneath the ledge. Her hands hovered near the flames, trembling from cold, but her eyes never left the bound men. Her voice came soft, carried on the wind. They said, "The helicopter is coming." Mark lowered himself beside her, breath ragged, leg stiff. 60 minutes. Emily hugged her knees. That's not long. It sounded like a bedtime story she told herself against the dark. Mark studied her face in the firelight. 60 minutes could be a lifetime, or nothing at all. Behind them, Kane chuckled, sharp against the storm. "You think rescue will reach you? That fire's a beacon for my men as much as yours." Shadow's growl cut him off, low and steady. Raphael kicked snow against Kane's legs, forcing him down. "Shut up." But Kane's eyes kept wandering. To Emily, to Shadow, to the folder. He was chained, but his poison still spread. The storm gnawed at them, the fire sputtering into a fragile circle of light. The prisoners shivered on their knees, heads low. Kane sat apart, blood on his sleeve from Shadow's bite, posture rigid as if the snow were a throne. Emily huddled opposite him. Shadow curled at her side, his growl constant. She hadn't spoken in minutes, only stared into the flames. Kane finally leaned forward, voice sharp. "You don't know what it takes to survive." His eyes narrowed on her. "Out here it isn't courage, it's choices, ugly ones, Men kill brothers, fathers abandon children, mothers sell what they swore to protect. His sneer deepened. And you're just a child. You wouldn't last a day without them dragging you along. Raphael's jaw tightened. Kyle stirred weakly near the fire, listening. Mark kept his pistol trained, gaze locked on Emily. Her hand tightened in Shadow's fur. The shepherd pressed against her side. She drew a breath. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost lost in the wind. I know what love does. Kane's smile faltered. Emily lifted her eyes, gaze steady. Love doesn't kill. It doesn't leave. It doesn't sell. Love saves. The words landed heavy, deeper than any bullet. Silence stretched. Even the storm seemed to pause. Raphael swallowed hard. He had heard confessions, last words, desperate lies, but never conviction like this. From a child. It shook him. Kane spat, anger cracking through his composure. Naive. Love doesn't stop bullets. Emily pressed her cheek into Shadow's fur. Her whisper came again, quiet but unbroken. It stopped me from giving up. Mark's throat tightened. His daughter's laughter flickered in memory, colliding with Emily's voice. Kyle let out a hoarse breath that might have been agreement. Even Raphael's grip on his rifle steadied, as if her words bound them more tightly than orders ever had. Kane leaned back, venom thick in his voice. That thinking will get you killed. Emily didn't flinch. She whispered into Shadow's ear. Then I'll die with love. Not like you. Shadow's growl rose, tail thumping once in the snow, punctuating her words like judgment. And in that moment, hardened Rafael Torres felt something stir he thought long gone. Not faith in governments or orders, but in people. In a child's unshaken belief. The ridge groaned beneath the storm. Snow whipped across the clearing, burying tracks within minutes. Behind them, the lookout tower's skeleton glowed like a torch in the sky. It was a beacon, yes, but perhaps not enough. They needed to be found. Raphael crouched with a strip of reflective material scavenged from a mercenary's pack. He angled it toward the firelight, flashing in rhythm into the storm. Maybe they'll see it, he muttered. Mark leaned on his good leg, pale but steady. 3 flashes, pause, 3 again. SOS. Kyle managed a weak smile. Oldest trick in the book. Emily watched, hope and fear mixed in her eyes. Then Shadow stirred. The shepherd rose, favoring his injured paw, but steady. He planted himself in the snow, lifted his head, and barked. Not random. 3 sharp bursts. Pause. 3 long howls, drawn and steady, echoing off the ridges. Silence. Then 3 short again. Emily gasped. He's doing it. Raphael froze, reflective strip still in hand. Shadow repeated the rhythm, clear and deliberate. SOS. Mark's breath caught. His chest tightened. He remembers. Raphael had heard of dogs trained long ago to signal distress, but it was rare, buried history. Yet here Shadow was, voice cutting through the storm in perfect rhythm, ancient as Morse, universal as desperation. Emily pressed against him, tears streaking her face, her whisper full of awe. Shadow's calling them. He's telling them where we are. The men listened in silence. Each bark carried farther than any flicker of light. The sound was primal, impossible to mistake. Kyle laughed weakly, voice breaking. Smarter than all of us. Raphael lowered the strip, humbled. Forget the beacon. The dog's the signal. Mark's voice was low, reverent. Better than radio. Better than flares. He never forgot. The fire painted Shadow in gold and red, his scars glowing, his chest heaving with every bark. He looked less like a wounded animal and more like a sentinel, an old warrior still guarding his people. Emily wrapped her arms around him, whispering into his fur, "You saved us again." The officers exchanged a glance, exhausted, battered, but awed. They had fought, bled, nearly died to keep alive. But it was the shepherd, scarred, relentless, who carried the memory, the discipline, the signal machines could fail to give. And with each call into the storm, hope grew louder. The storm muffled the world into white silence, until the crack of boots on snow shattered it. Raphael heard it first. His hand shot up in warning, just as 6 masked figures emerged from the tree line, rifles raised, moving with the precision of men who knew exactly where to strike. Reinforcements. The ridge had become a trap. "Down!" he barked, dragging Kyle behind a half-buried rock. Bullets ripped through the air, sparking off stone, carving trails into the snow. Emily gasped, dropping low and pulling Shadow with her. She pressed herself against the frozen rock, arms wrapped tight around his neck. Her whisper trembled but held. "Stay down, Shadow. Please. Stay with me." The shepherd obeyed, pressed flat to the ground, his growl vibrating against her chest. His amber eyes flicked toward the tree line, but Emily's grip kept him anchored. Mark fired back, his pistol bucking in his hands. Each shot cost him pain, his wound screaming with every movement, but he ignored it. Raphael's rifle answered in sharp bursts, muzzle flashes tearing the storm into stuttering light. Snow exploded around them under the mercenaries' fire. Emily ducked lower, covering her head, Shadow's growl building into a roar he kept caged only by her touch. Kyle clutched a dropped rifle, hands shaking, breath ragged. His first shot went wide, but it bought them a heartbeat. "They're flanking left!" Raphael shouted. "They'll pin us." Mark glanced at Emily, small arms locked around Shadow, whispering to keep him calm. His chest tightened. "Not with her here." "We hold this ridge." The firefight intensified, muzzle flashes cutting like lightning, voices barking clipped commands. Emily pressed her cheek into Shadow's fur, whispering over and over, "Don't leave me. Don't go." Her voice shook, but she didn't cry. A bullet struck the rock above, showering her hair with stone shards. She didn't move. Shadow's muscles quivered beneath her arms, caught between fury and obedience. Mark snapped his last round into the storm. The pistol clicked empty. "Out!" Raphael cursed, slamming a fresh magazine into his rifle. "We can't hold them like this." Mark's voice cut raw but steady. "We don't need to. Just 60 minutes. The storm wailed, bullets and snow mixing into one blur of survival. At the heart of it, Emily clung to Shadow, whispering his name like a prayer. The Shadow moved. With a sudden burst, he tore free from Emily's arms and surged into the open. Snow flew beneath his paws as he sprinted toward the tree line. His limp was clear, his wounded paw dragging, but it didn't slow him. "Shadow!" Emily's scream pierced the firefight. Bullets tracked instantly, mercenaries shouting as they followed the blur of fur. Shots ripped past, spraying snow, but the shepherd wove low and fast, more predator than prey. Emily's scream broke into sobs until she realized Shadow wasn't charging blindly, he was leading them. Her wide eyes darted to the tree line, the faint shimmer of wires buried in snow, snares, pits, traps, Kane's men had laid earlier, revealed only once before by Shadow's nose. Raphael saw it too. His eyes widened. Holy hell, he's herding them. Shadow darted left, barking sharp and commanding. 3 mercenaries followed, stepping right into the death field they'd built. The first boot snapped a wire. Steel jaws clamped around his leg. His scream split the storm. The second stumbled backward, straight through a thin ice crust. He plunged into a pit, his cry cut short by sharpened stakes. The third panicked at Shadow's bark, spun wildly, and blundered into another wire. A concealed spike trap snapped shut, silencing him in a gurgled gasp. Emily's tears ran hot down her frozen cheeks. She had thought he was leaving her, but he was protecting her, turning cruelty back on itself. Her voice broke into awe. "Shadow, you're saving us." The mercenaries faltered, confidence shattered. Their formation broke as traps devoured their advance. "Now!" Raphael roared, rising from cover. He fired controlled bursts, cutting down another man scrambling in panic. Mark dragged himself upright, legs screaming, but steady enough to put a bullet into a mercenary's shoulder, spinning him into the snow. Kyle forced another shot, wide but close enough to pin a survivor down. The tide shifted. Shadow circled back through the storm, chest heaving, blood dripping from his paw, but he stood proud, growl rolling like thunder. 3 mercenaries gone, 1 wounded, 2 faltering. Their trap had become their grave. Mark's voice carried across the ridge, raw with defiance. "You're not hunting us anymore. We're hunting you." Emily clutched her chest, whispering through her tears. "He came back. He always comes back." The ridge fell silent except for the wind and their ragged breaths. Snow drifted over bodies like shrouds. Shadow stood guard, bloodied but unbowed, his growl steady. Then came the sound. A faint thrum, swallowed at first by the storm, then louder, stronger. The chop of blades. Helicopters. Emily lifted her head, eyes wide. Searchlights pierced the dark, cutting the ridge in stark beams of white. Raphael's shoulders sagged, though his rifle stayed high. Mark kept his pistol raised, unwilling to trust relief too quickly. Kyle slumped, a delirious smile twitching at his lips. The helicopters roared overhead, blades scattering snow into whirlwinds. Ropes dropped. Black silhouettes slid down, agents in clean gear moving with practiced precision. They hit the ground in formation, rifles sweeping. "Secure the perimeter. Check those bodies." In moments, chaos turned to order. Agents fanned out, forcing the surviving mercenaries flat into the snow. 2 men hauled Kane upright. The ex-commissioner fought like a cornered beast, his polished mask gone. His voice broke into a scream. "You think this ends me? Chains won't stop what I built. You're pawns. Do you hear me? Pawns!" The agents ignored him, binding him tighter, dragging him toward the rope. His empire, his untouchable arrogance, crumbled with every step. Emily flinched at his rage, then turned, burying her face in Mark's chest. He wrapped his arms around her instinctively, holding her close despite the blood and snow soaking his coat. She sobbed hard, muffled against him, raw and unfiltered. Mark closed his eyes, pressing his chin to her tangled hair. For the first time since the ambush, he breathed, not in pain or duty, but fragile human relief. Shadow pressed against them, leaning into Mark's leg, nudging Emily's shoulder. His growl had softened to a steady rumble, not warning now, but reassurance. His amber eyes tracked Kane until the man disappeared into the helicopter, his screams fading into the storm. Raphael approached, soot streaking his face, the leather folder still clutched under his arm. He glanced at Mark and Emily, then at Shadow. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "It's over. At least tonight." Mark nodded faintly, arms still around the child. "Not over. Just beginning." But she made it. Emily clung tighter, her sobs easing into broken breaths. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her small body pressed against him said everything. Above them, helicopters hovered like steel angels, lights piercing the storm. Around them, agents secured prisoners and tended wounds, restoring order to the shattered ridge. But at the heart of it, amidst fire, snow, and blood, a child wept into a soldier's coat. A scarred shepherd leaned close, and 3 broken men realized that somehow, against every betrayal, every trap, they had survived. Days after the ridge, the storm and gunfire felt like another world. The roar of helicopters and the crack of rifles had been replaced by the hum of machines and the quiet rhythm of medical halls. Ranger, once Shadow, lay stretched on a padded cot in the veterinary trauma center. Bandages wrapped his paw. Tubes ran into his foreleg. Monitors blinked steadily. His chest rose and fell in slow, even rhythm. Scars still marred his body, but for the first time in years, he looked at peace. Emily sat beside him every day. Her ritual never changed. A styrofoam cup of hot chocolate too big for her hands, crayons stuffed into her coat pocket, and fresh paper she spread carefully on the table. She talked while she drew, sometimes about the mountains, how the snow had glittered by firelight, sometimes about the future. "When you get better, I'll buy you a collar," she whispered one morning. "Not Shadow anymore, Ranger, like a hero." The shepherd's ears twitched at her voice. Though his eyes stayed closed, his tail thumped faintly against the cot. Emily grinned, pressing her hand against his fur. "See, you're listening." Mark often sat in the corner, silent. His jacket hung on the chair, replaced by plain clothes that made him look less like a soldier and more like a tired man. His leg was bound, crutches leaning against the wall. He said little of the pain. In his lap lay a stack of papers. Raphael thought it was another report, until one afternoon he caught the heading, "Adoption Request, Canine Unit Survivor." Mark's fingers hovered over the signature line, pen idle. His eyes drifted between Ranger, Emily, and the forms. The decision wasn't in doubt. It was written on his face. He wasn't adopting a dog. He was anchoring a promise. Emily noticed once, looking up from her crayons. "You're taking him with you," she said. Not as a question, but a fact. Mark's throat tightened. "If he'll have me." Her smile was the first true one since the ridge. "He already does." The days blurred. Emily filled the walls with drawings. Ranger with a cape, Ranger on a ridge, Ranger surrounded by stars. Nurses grumbled at the clutter, but never touched a page. Raphael visited sometimes, arms crossed, but eyes soft. Kyle came too, pale but healing, dropping candy bars he swore were doctor's orders. But it was Emily who never left, keeping vigil as though her presence alone stitched Ranger back together. Mark watched her, his daughter's ghost flickering at the edges of his vision. But instead of crushing grief, the memory now gave him something else, a reminder that love hadn't died with her. It had found its way back, through a scarred dog and a child who refused to give up. One evening, as snow drifted against the window, Ranger stirred. His head lifted. His eyes found Emily's. She gasped, nearly spilling her cocoa, and pressed her forehead to his. "You're awake," she whispered, tears streaming. "You came back." Mark rose, setting the adoption forms on the table. He laid his palm gently on the shepherd's head. His voice carried not command, but vow. You're home now, Ranger. For good. Snow drifted across the Denver courthouse steps, settling on coats and flags. The city's hum had quieted under winter air, replaced by murmurs of gathered voices. Officers in pressed uniforms lined the stairs, medals catching pale sunlight. Federal agents stood among them, stiff-backed, their presence both protective and symbolic. Families huddled close, children clutching hands as if they sensed the weight of the day. At the center stood Emily. Her gloved hand gripped the harness of the German shepherd beside her. His scars were still visible beneath fresh fur, but his posture was proud, his chest broad. The new harness gleamed black, stitched in bold white letters, "Still here." Emily traced the words often, as if to be sure they were real. At her side, Ranger stood steady, ears pricked, eyes alert, as though he knew he was no longer just a survivor. Mark Ellison stepped forward, limp, obvious, but posture unbowed. The crutches were gone. He carried only the papers that had made this day possible. Adoption finalized, scars accepted, future chosen. The murmurs fell silent. Mark's voice rose, not booming but steady, forged through fire and loss. Some of you know what happened on that mountain. Some have only heard fragments, gunfire in the storm, men lost, truths unearthed. But what I stand here to tell you isn't about tactics or reports. It's about survival. And what survival really means. His gaze drifted to Emily, her hand clenched on Ranger's harness, her eyes tilted up at him with trust far older than her years. I've seen men die for each other. I've seen choices that tear families apart. But what I learned on that ridge wasn't from another soldier. It was from a child, and from a dog who refused to let go. A ripple went through the crowd. Officers shifted. Mothers pulled children close. Mark's voice softened, but carried farther in the hush. Sometimes God doesn't send us the heroes we expect. Sometimes he sends us angels with paws. To remind us loyalty isn't a word, it's an oath. To remind us love doesn't abandon, doesn't betray, doesn't break. Love saves. Emily's breath fogged in the cold, her eyes shining. Ranger's tail thumped once against the stone steps, the sound faint but firm, punctuating the words. Mark drew a breath, his throat tight. This harness doesn't just say, "Still here." It says even in fire, betrayal, and storms meant to erase us, somehow we endure. And as long as we stand, none of us are alone. For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Then applause rose, soft at first, then swelling. Families, agents, officers, the courthouse steps thundered. Emily flushed, burying her face briefly in Ranger's neck. The shepherd stood taller, as if the sound was not for him alone, but for every life carried through the storm. Mark stepped back, his hand brushing Emily's shoulder. Together, with Ranger at their side, they faced the crowd. Not broken, not forgotten, but proof that survival was more than breathing. It was love, enduring. Snow drifted still, quiet and endless, as though even the sky understood. Morning light crept over the mountains, soft and deliberate, painting the peaks in pale gold. In a sunlit room at the veterinary center, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, crayons spread like a rainbow. Her hands moved carefully, filling the page not just with shapes, but with memory. At the center of the drawing were 4 figures: Ranger, strong and watchful; Mark, kneeling with a hand on the dog's neck; Raphael, standing vigilant; Kyle, smiling faintly at their side. They weren't just drawings. They were her family, forged in fire. Ranger, now healed, lay beside her. His harness gleamed, his ears twitching at distant sounds. Every so often he nudged her crayon with his nose, approving her work. His paw brushed hers lightly, a reminder of the bond that had carried them through snow and gunfire. Mark leaned in the doorway, watching silently. The signed adoption papers sat on the counter, but his eyes were on the girl and the dog. He could see in her determined expression the same resilience he had seen in soldiers, refusal to let tragedy define her. Here it was raw, unfiltered, and beautiful. Raphael visited that morning too, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his usual gruffness softened. Kyle sat nearby, still pale but recovering, a candy bar in hand. For once they weren't officers or survivors or patients. They were simply present, bound by something wordless. Emily shaded the mountains in gold, her small voice breaking the silence. "This is us. All of us. You saved me. We saved you. We all made it." Ranger tilted his head, eyes bright, and barked once, short and proud. Mark stepped forward, crouching to her side. He rested a hand on her shoulder. "It's perfect," he said quietly. "This is how it should be remembered. Not the fear, not the danger, but the ones who refused to give up." Emily's eyes shone. "Even when it was scary?" "Especially then," Mark replied. The room filled with a quiet that wasn't empty, but whole. Outside, snow glittered like fractured diamonds under the dawn. Emily traced Ranger's outline one last time, then set her crayon aside. She looked at the men around her, her makeshift family, and whispered, "We did it." Mark, Raphael, Kyle, and Ranger stood silently with her. There were no words strong enough to capture months of storm, fire, and pain. But there was this. Sunlight through snow, a child's drawing on the floor, and the unshakable bond of love that had carried them all home. The final frame lingered in the room, Emily kneeling beside Shadow, crayons scattered, 3 men standing watchful, yet at peace, mountains beyond the window glistening, and the dog's eyes reflecting the sun, breaking over the snowy ridges. A single bark echoed once more, proud, resolute, a punctuation on a story that had begun in fear and ended in hope. Outside, the world continued, indifferent yet magnificent. And in the quiet of that room, among crayons, papers, and gentle warmth, survival had become something tangible, something worth remembering, not just as an escape, but as a testament to what loyalty, courage, and love could accomplish when ordinary beings rose to extraordinary challenges. There's something quietly miraculous about the bond between humans and dogs, the way a German shepherd trusts, protects, and loves with every ounce of their being reminds us that loyalty isn't just a word, it's a living, breathing presence. Shadow's story shows how courage, companionship, and simple love can carry us through the darkest moments, and how a dog's devotion can help heal not only their own wounds, but ours too. If you've ever felt that quiet comfort from your own dog, you know what I mean. And if you'd like to explore ways to deepen that connection, whether through training, play, or just learning to understand each other better, there are gentle resources that can help guide you. One I've come across has been really thoughtful, practical, and kind, and it might give you ideas you didn't even know you were missing. Take a peek if it feels right. No pressure, just a friendly nudge toward enjoying every small, meaningful moment with the one who waits for you with a wagging tail. And remember, love and loyalty, once shared, only grow stronger.